behind it. Right. Right, okay, so yeah, it's the result of a partnership between the University of Leeds and Corps Security, which is the contemporary incarnation of the Corps of Commissionaires. This is the first academic study of the Corps, and it's a really great opportunity to be able to share my initial findings with you today. So the Corps was founded in 1859 by Edward Walter, and I guess the best way of explaining what it was is that in modern parlance, it was effectively an employment agency and was dedicated to finding work for disabled ex-servicemen. As you might better tell from the image on the title page, the Corps operated along quasi-military lines. And Walter viewed employment as being absolutely central to the successful transition of these men, these two disabled ex-servicemen, as you can see there, back into civilian life. And the Corps' motto made that really clear. With courage and energy, labour conquers all. So, what I want to do today is cover off three main things. First of all, I consider the motivations for establishing the Corps, what its principles were, and how these were embedded in the identity of the disabled commissionaire. Second, I'll discuss the challenges that the Corps faced in its formative years and the impact that these had on its development. And then third, I'll discuss that despite commercial pressures, the Corps maintained its commitment to disabled men, albeit with a change in emphasis, and how this became apparent in the organisation's publicity materials. My key argument today is going to be that the masculinised identity of the commissionaire was not an achievable idea for some of the disabled men that worked with it. Indeed, this group came to be marginalised within the Corps, both in terms of its membership, its regulation, and also its regulations rather than also its public presentation. However, for a minority of men, the ideal was achievable, and this resulted in them experiencing long-term materials security, and these men thrived in the mainstream, that is, non-rehabilitative work environment that the Corps offered. I'll conclude by arguing that despite these caveats, the Corps' approach to this area was highly progressive, and in many respects prefigured post-First World War initiatives from the voluntary sector that sought to provide employment for disabled ex-servicemen. Before I begin, I should probably mention that due to the sensitive nature of some of the biographic information that features in my study, some of which I'll allude to today, the identities of individual commissionaires have been anonymised using pseudonyms. So, this is Edward Walter. Walter was a retired British Army captain, and he dedicated his post-service life to the Corps of Commissionaires, which under his leadership expanded from 8 in 1859 through to just under 3,000 prior to his death in 1904. His family owned the Times newspaper, and his life before he established the Corps followed a very typical upper-middle-class trajectory. He was born in 1823, educated at Eton and Oxford, and then having graduated, he purchased a commission in the British Army, where he served for 10 years, from 1843 to 1853. He was very clear that commissionaires had to be fully self-reliant, and he stated that, quote, "No one is fit to belong to the Corps who has not the highest feelings of independence." So this statement gives an indication of just how strongly opposed to charity Walter was. He absolutely abhorred charity. However, whilst the men were self-reliant, the Corps itself relied on subscriptions from the officer class of the British Army, and the way in which these subscriptions were raised by Walter tells us much about the masculinised traditions of the Victorian Army, and also how he placed the disabled commissionaires firmly within that environment. Walter left the army just before the outbreak of the Crimean War in 1854, and that resulted in large numbers of disabled ex-servicemen returning to Britain, such as the men that you can see here in this image. This photograph is taken from a series of photographs that were commissioned by Queen Victoria, based on her hospital visits to these men when they returned from the war, some of which were then shown publicly in an exhibition a couple of years later. I think it's worthwhile looking at this image for a second. It strikes me as being a very unsettling image. And whilst the prosthetic that's held by the man on the right-hand side offers some element of hope, I'm always drawn back to the sort of the stares of the men and frankly what appears to be their sort of a very hopeless situation. The war had stimulated huge public interest in the conditions experienced by the rank and file soldier in the field, and this absolutely extended to interest in the plight of these men when they returned from the war. The pensions that these men received from the British government were at best meagre, and therefore, irrespective of their disability, they had to find some form of work. But needless to say, for disabled men like this, finding work was incredibly difficult. And there were a significant number of press reports at the time that talked about the privations that some of these disabled men experienced. Some of them were in abjectly miserable positions, and some of the reports focused on their inability to find work, their shattered bodies, and also how many of them suffered from alcoholism. A number of whom were forced to resort to begging, and the workhouse was seemingly a constant threat. A contemporary observer labelled the government's neglect of these men a deep stain on our national character, and called for the establishment of local employment registers to help them find work. But the government didn't provide any such solution. So in the absence of any government response, the Corps presented the public with an opportunity to offer support for these disabled men through providing them with employment. Walter used the letters pages of the Times to publicise the establishment of the organisation, and his first correspondence was published on the 29th of January, 1859. He presented the commissionaire as an idealised ex-serviceman whose military service deserved to be honoured, and whose prior military training had imbued qualities such as discipline and trustworthiness, which he believed would make these men attractive to employers. For the unemployed disabled ex-serviceman, becoming a commissionaire offered the prospect of a secure future, provided he conformed to the Corps' rules. Now, these rules were formulated to promote the behaviour that Walter expected his men to deliver, and he firmly stated his view on the interdependence of these behaviours and the employment prospects for ex-servicemen, where he stated, quote, that there is an abundance of work for all wounded soldiers and sailors, provided sobriety and good conduct are united. The letter to the Times also outlined the messenger services that commissionaires would offer and where their stations would be located within central London. He prioritised the role of messenger over other occupations as it was suited to the physical capabilities of these men. But there was already stiff competition for this kind of employment within London's teeming street economy, and Walter understood that a point of difference would be necessary for these men if they were to succeed in this environment. This point of difference was effectively communicated by the Illustrated London News, who reported on the launch of the course a month after the first launch to the Times. So the report of March 1859 emphasised the organisation's quasi-military identity, which the accompanying illustration of these two disabled ex-servicemen perfectly encapsulates. Central to their identity is their military-style uniform, which, along with the men's disability, confirmed their past service career, which in turn conferred a deserving status on these men. The report also noted that the Corps was supported by Prince Albert and the Prince of Wales, and this royal support helped further legitimise the organisation. The report stated the nature of the Corps' rules, and also that a financial guarantee would be given by Walter, which would enable people to trust that these men would carry out a commercial transaction. Without this trust, the Corps could not operate as a self-funding organisation, and Walter was to state repeatedly throughout his leadership of the Corps that it was not a charity and that he operated as a businessman. So if we look at these men's, if we look at the illustration of these men, their dignity and their utility stands in stark contrast to the representation that I shared with you earlier, and also the type of press reports where which stress, the helplessness of disabled ex-servicemen. And I think that comparison is really important, because it's some of the visual representations that I'll share with you later on, they all centred around the men's uniforms, and that was a really consistent element of those representations. But this consistency was delivered through comparing the commission to an ever-changing group of others. So in other words, the identity of the communication of the commissionaire was comprised of who he was, but also who he was not. And this cast of others that was called upon by Walter ebbed and flowed at their importance based on the changing societal conceptions of the veteran throughout this period. Now, if the uniform of the commissionaires embodied Walter's ideals, then the rules and regulations of the Corps guaranteed it to employers. Now, these rules were first made publicly available in 1864, and the first page of the rules made clear the Corps' commitment to disabled men, where it stated that Those who have been severely wounded will have preference for admission into the Corps. So this 1864 edition ran to 31 pages, and 41 clauses alone were listed under the discipline, punishment and fine section. The commissionaire had to, quote, obey all orders and on no account attempt to be his own judge. A refusal to obey an order, insulting a senior officer, or drunkenness could all result in dismissal and, extreme cases, a forfeiture of the commissionaire's caution money, which they deposited on entering the Corps. But the rules also emphasised the paternalistic nature of the Corps. Evening classes were offered to the commissionaires, as well as their sons, no, not their daughters, but to their sons, and the men were required to contribute to the Corps savings bank and its sick and burial fund. In addition, single men were required to live in the Corps barracks, where for a weekly cost of 10 shillings, they received their meals in a comfortable single room. Walter was adamant, bearing in mind his hatred of charity, that the commissionaires would not experience penury, that they should receive the best possible medical treatment and not suffer the indignity of a pauper's burial. His emphasis on discipline and welfare is consistent with what Derek Fraser has observed around Victorian philanthropy, where he argues that, quote, an authoritarian society was an essential belief of paternalism, and the first duty of the paternalist was to rule. And this approach absolutely characterised the manner in which Walter led the Corps and how it developed under his leadership. The picture you can see here is a group of men who became known as the original eight, that is, the 8 founding members of the Corps. As you can see, each of these men had an arm amputated owing to their military service, and their disability is absolutely central to this image, as is the cannon and also the men's medals, all of which the men are proudly displaying, and one of which included a Victoria Cross. I've investigated the experiences of these 8 men, which I found really instructive for 2 reasons. First, it gives an indication of the kind of disciplinary challenges that the Corps faced in its formative years. And second, it also gives us a sense of the complexities of the post-service lives of some of these men. So one of these men, Samuel Dawes, died in service as a commissionaire in 1907, so having served as a commissionaire for 48 years. 2 of the men resigned after 8 and 25 years respectively, and the fate of one is unrecorded. Of the remaining 4, they were all dismissed, 3 for repeated incidents of drunkenness. One of these men, Arthur Seal, had a long history of violence towards his wife, and on one occasion he threatened to kill her in front of other commissionaires. Another, Wilfred Hogg, ended up in the workhouse, where he died aged 48. Now, there's evidence that problems with alcohol were especially prevalent, not just amongst this group, but also other disabled commissionaires. That said, drunkenness was to prove a perennial problem for able-bodied men as well as disabled commissionaires. And it was the most common disciplinary problem, which could result in dismissal. And during the 1860s, an average of 38 commissionaires were dismissed per year. And because of that, the growth was fairly faltering in the first decade of the Corps' existence. During these formative years, other cases of ill discipline connected to fraud and dishonesty were also recorded. And a particular concern, given the central role played by the uniform, were cases of dismissed commissionaires who retained their uniforms to pose as legitimate members of the Corps. The actions of one imposter, Joseph Foster, led to a well-reported court case, which resulted in being sentenced to 6 months hard labour for fraud. As well as their uniforms, the physical locations of the commissionaires also set the men apart and further added to their legitimacy. The disability historian Brendan Gleeson argues that the streets were, quote, sites rather than merely conduits of economic production. They were a place of importance for disabled people in the industrial city. The Corps barracks were based on the Strand, and the men occupied around 50 stands within the City of London, the West End, railway stations, and some of the most expensive residential areas within the city. In addition, commissionaires acted as doormen for numerous gentlemen's clubs in Pall Mall and also fashionable shops. Why I think this is important is that these locations communicated that the commissionaires represented a body of men who were trusted by some of the most affluent businesses, institutions, and households within London. And this provided another element of prestige, which further distanced the men from other, perhaps less reputable elements of the street economy, which many disabled individuals were forced to take part in. There are numerous cultural representations of the commissionaire from the mid-1870s onwards, and these are suggestive of a level of public recognition that belied the relatively small number of commissionaires, which by 1875 stood at just under 600. One of the most interesting representations from this period is the image that you can see here, which is taken from a children's book called London Characters. I'll let you read the accompanying rhyme, but I think what's interesting is just how purposeful and focused the commissionaire is depicted as being in the way that he performs his duty. And the accompanying rhyme really does indicate the author's positive attitude towards the Corps. It makes clear that the commissionaire's military service and disability act as a motivation for engaging him, and implicit within that is that the loss of his arm does not hinder his ability. Indeed, he will carry out his duties cheerfully. But the reality of this kind of work could be somewhat different. From a physical perspective, the commissionaires were contracted to walk at a minimum speed of 2.5 miles an hour when employed as a messenger. And if work was slack, the men could earn no money. The work could leave them exhausted after a working day that might include, for some of them, covering up to 30 miles by foot. As Daniel Blackie has noted in his study of disabled coal miners of the period, being reassigned to poorer paid and less physically demanding work did challenge conceptions of the masculine identity of coal miners, yet their injuries had been incurred in a masculine environment, and thus, quote, those very same injuries may also have simultaneously provided them with an effective buffer against the worst ravages of emasculation. And I think a similar observation can be made around the disabled commissionaires. Compared to their previous service lines, the role was not obviously emasculating, but its menial nature offered very little affirmation, certainly compared to their prior lives in the army. As a former army officer, Walter understood the power of military symbols, and he recognised how they could be transposed onto a civilian organisation to lend it legitimacy in the eyes of employers and the wider public. The most powerful expression of this was the Corps Annuals Parade, an example which you can see here. This photograph is taken from the 1893 parade. Walter used these events to communicate the prestige of the Corps through demonstrating its connections with the royal family and senior military figures. These events had started in 1868, but with the advent of photography being featured in popular journalism, the coverage of these events really took on an added dimension. By the time of this image in 1893, the Corps' strength stood at just under 2,000 men. I think what's also interesting is the way in which the quasi-military identity of the Corps firmly aligned the organisation with the British Army. And I think that was important because, as I mentioned earlier, the Army was the sole source of funding that Walter relied on to cover the operational costs of the organisation. His appeals to this group for funding were steeped in the military language at the time, and in particular, the officers' obligation towards their men's well-being. Walter argued that these obligations should be extended into the men's post-service lives through providing financial support through the Corps. In many respects, he viewed parades as a showcase for these men. It was important that they took the opportunity to present their continued military bearing, to show the officers who supported the Corps that theirs was a wise investment, and of course that it should be continued. The image that you can see here, which was labelled Guard of Honour, was taken, or rather was included in the press coverage of the 1896 parade. And set alongside this were similar tableaus of younger, able-bodied commissionaires. The photograph that you can see here demonstrated the role that the Corps had helped in helping aged men like this prepare for old age. I think why this is interesting is that the period saw a huge upsurge in public interest around elderly veterans of the Crimean War who were seemingly rediscovered by the public. Press coverage of these men often focused on their penury and also the charitable work that had helped rescue these forgotten men, some of whom were residing in the workhouse at the time. Alongside this, the veterans' cultural presence became much more prominent, which mirrored a growing popularity in the British Army overall. This was especially true of the Chelsea pensioner, who came to be an incredibly well-recognised figure by the end of the late 19th century. His image could be found in everything from advertising to popular illustrations, and then prior to the First World War, he actually featured in army recruitment advertisements. Consequently, he became one of the most recognised veteran identities in this period. Now, I think if you compare the identity of the Chelsea pensioner to the identity of the men that you can see here, the identity of these men were very, very different. And I think that identity, that difference rather, was affirmed through the constant visual representation of the link between the men here and his younger comrades in the Corps. And I think to a degree, this lent his identity of vitality, whilst his uniform connected him not only to his service life, but also his post-service employment. And I think if you compare the commissionaire's uniform to the uniform of the Chelsea pensioner, it was very, very different. The pensioner uniform was obviously symbolic of his institutional life and the dependency that went with it. Representation such as this provided further proof to the officer class that theirs was a wise investment. But also, I think it illustrated to serving soldiers the benefits of a post-career service as a commissionaire. However, by the latter part of the 19th century, the Corps was experiencing increased demand from employers around physical jobs such as night watchmen and porters. And this led to Walter facing greater challenges in finding suitable employment for disabled men. And he had to reconcile these challenges with his objectives of increasing the number of commissionaires. I mentioned earlier how the rules stated the Corps' commitment to disabled men. Well, in 1883, the rules were changed to qualify this commitment somewhat. And that year's edition of the rules stated that men who were incapacitated through the effects of service will have every advantage given to them, consistent with fairness to their comrades and the interests of their employers. In other words, Walter's support, the Corps' support for disabled men, started to become somewhat qualified, given the challenges that he was facing in finding these men work. My ongoing research into the personnel statistics of the Leeds division of the Corps provides a useful insight around the impact of these changes. So if we look at the period from 1901 to 1913, there are a total of 352 admissions, and of that total, disabled men accounted for 12%. However, if we break these figures down, I've shown that in 1901, 02, and 05, disabled men accounted actually for 38% of total recruits. And these increases can be attributed to men who were disabled through serving in the Boer War. And these men were like Albert Richards, who had his leg amputated and who was discharged by the army aged 25, having served for 6 years. Richards joined the Corps in Leeds in 1902 and had a long career with them, and died in service aged 58 in 1931. I'm still researching his background, so at this stage I can't share anything around the type of roles that he performed or what his cause of death was, but it's clear from these statistics that from his records that his disability did not hinder him as a commissioner, and he served for 29 years. But his experience was very unusual, as my research from the first part of this period has indicated. The resignation rate amongst disabled men was 86%, with 64% being the equivalent for able-bodied men. And if we look at the 1902 admissions of the men that resigned, and the average length of tenure for the disabled men was 22 months compared to 124 months for able-bodied. That is just under 12 years. And I think these differences are significant, and they suggest that the Corps faced ongoing challenges in securing employment for these men, as well as perhaps that the commissionaires encountered barriers themselves, or perhaps discrimination in the workplace. Either way, their disability would appear to be a determining factor in the average length of tenure within the Corps. I'd like now to turn to the impact of the First World War. And before I look at how this impacted on the Corps, it's worth considering the sheer numbers of men who returned to civilian life disabled, like the men that you can see here. By March 1919, just under 670,000 men were in receipt of a pension from the newly formed Ministry of Pension. And the way in which these pensions were awarded and administered is probably worth commenting on briefly. First of all, the scale of a man's pension, was entirely dependent on the level of his disability. So the chap that you can see there in the wheelchair, double amputee, he received the maximum pension, which amounted to 27 shillings and sixpence a week. So very much like the Crimean veterans that we talked about earlier, that would not be enough for this man to survive on, and therefore employment was vital. But needless to say, the search for employment, these men could experience huge challenges in their search for employment, which brings me back to the personnel statistics of the Corps, specifically the Leeds division. So the number of men who joined the Corps from 1914 to 1918 is relatively low at 56 recruits, although of that number, 50% of the recruits in both 1917 and 1918 were disabled. Now, the following years saw a reduction in the ratio of disabled to able-bodied men. Although the percentage of disabled recruits did hold up, the average annual proportion of recruits at 22% represented a lower proportion than the 38% around the Boer War that we discussed earlier. What I think is interesting is how an examination of some of the individual men who made up these statistics and how they provide clues around the experiences that disabled men might experience on their return to civilian life. The first of these, Joseph Murphy, was a former butcher who had his left cheek mutilated through serving on the Western Front. He left the army with an exemplary service record, having been promoted to sergeant. However, he only stayed in the Corps for 2 years and resigned in 1921. Another commissionaire, Robert Wells, was a father of 2, joined the army in 1912, aged 20. He had his right arm amputated at the age of 24, having served on the Western Front, and he was a commissionaire for 11 years before he resigned in 1932. Harold Brownlow, on the other hand, was dismissed, having only served in the Corps for just under a year. He received a gunshot wound at Ypres and was a family of 4, and his age was 36 at the point of his dismissal from the Corps. Now, given the level of problems that disabled men experienced in the employment market, a number of employment schemes grew up within the voluntary sector to try and help these men help these men try and find employment. And 2 examples of those schemes are shown here. On the left is the St Dunstan shop, which was situated on London Regent Street, which sold items produced by the blind servicemen that were which were helped by the charity. And on the right-hand side is the British Legion's poppy factory. Now, whilst both these initiatives enjoyed an incredibly high profile, both of them, even combined, employed relatively small numbers of men. And I think, importantly, they also relied on a level of public goodwill towards the disabled men that they employed. Is the inscription in the shop window of the St Dunstan shop made clear, where it said, "One good turn deserves another." In contrast, the commissionaires were employed on a commercial basis. This cigarette card from 1919 was part of a series entitled London Types, and I think it provides a useful insight into the public image of the commissionaires at the time, which was very much centred around the able-bodied majority of men. The physicality of this young-looking commissionaire is very different from the illustration of the disabled men in the children's book London Characters, which I shared with you earlier. Although the inscription on the back, which described the men as having exemplary characters and that the uniform is a guarantee of reliability and integrity, perfectly encapsulated the principles that the Corps had been founded on some 60 years earlier. This continuity can also be seen in the coverage of the Corps' 75th anniversary, which took place in June 1934. The coverage you can see here was taken from the Daily Mail on the the Daily Mirror on the 11th of June of that year, which was exclusively devoted to the Corps' celebrations, which, as you can see there, hopefully you can see there, was attended by King George V and Queen Mary. I think in many respects, the imagery that you can see here is virtually identical to the imagery of the annual parade that I shared earlier. And the Corps realised, as vital as this kind of coverage was, it wouldn't necessarily be enough to sustain it. And shortly before the 75th anniversary, it created the position of a publicity officer, who ended up delivering a highly distinctive publicity campaign that was designed to communicate the utility of the commissionaire and the roles that he could perform. And I think that was important because the Corps realised that it needed to make a distinction between what it offered and the type of men that it secured employment for, and some of the other schemes that were aimed at disabled servicemen that I touched on earlier. And I think in looking at this publicity, attempts to modernise the depiction of the commissionaires are really evident, as are more traditional references. And two examples of this publicity really stand out. The first example is a booklet that is entitled "What a Commissionaire Can Do," and which was published around the time of the 75th anniversary in 1934. As is forward stated, the prevailing impression is that the main function of these men is to act as door attendants. Yet for every man so employed, there are about 10 men engaged in other capacities, such as those shown here. So the intended communication of the booklet was clear. The commissionaire is an ex-serviceman whose aptitude made him suitable to roles that went beyond the menial, and the kind of roles that could be typically associated with employment schemes for disabled ex-servicemen, especially some of which we talked about earlier. So in other words, the commissionaire stood apart. He was an asset to contemporary businesses, and he could be employed as such rather than being employed out of any sense of duty or obligation or indeed pity. The second example is taken from the Daily Express on the 18th of May 1935. This was a series entitled, you can see, entitled "Our Man on the Door," and 5 of these articles were published, with each one featuring an individual commissionaire, which explained the role that he fulfilled. The man who's featured here, Drum Major Kenny, had received a VC for his action at Ypres and the bravery that he described there. Whilst the article emphasised his role, which was to provide security for a motor garage on Bond Street, it also emphasised his exceptional character, and therefore by inference why he was such a good employee. But I think perhaps the most telling element of this coverage is the Kipling reference that you can see there. Kenny is described as being straight out of Kipling, and I think that's important because it shows that the Corps was still very keen to be aligned with, the sort of the military values and the high imperialism of the 1880s and the 1890s. So in other words, what one gets here through this publicity is a balance between the traditional and the contemporary. But this emphasis on traditional values belied one important change. None of these men are disabled, and even though disabled men were still joining the Corps in 1935, for example, they represented 10% of all the recruits that joined the Leeds division. My analysis of the publicity cuttings from this period do not feature any commissionaires with disabilities, and I think the reasons for this are unclear. In one respect, it reflected the difficulty that Walter had already experienced in finding employment for these men in mainstream environments. Second, there's also evidence of a certain cultural squeamishness towards these men. Disabled ex-servicemen were marginalised at the Peace Day celebrations in 1919, and recent scholarship has indicated how the physical identities of these men could be manipulated by charities to present an acceptable face of disability in order to prompt donations. As the disability historian Julie Anderson has noted, for some would-be supporters, the mangled remains of men who had returned from the trenches were sometimes repellent to look at, and charities were clearly worried about presenting that kind of face to would-be donors. However, I have found one representation of disabled commissionaires, which is this Christmas card, which was produced at some point during the mid-1930s. it takes us back to the founding members of the Corps, the original 8 that I talked to earlier. I think what this card shows is that just how important finding work for disabled men was to the heritage of the Corps, but the fact that this image was in the minority shows that disabled men, despite this heritage, were no longer the priority for the Corps. As I mentioned earlier, they could be hard to place with employers, and the Corps had been required to broaden the base of recruits in order to grow the organisation. So I think to conclude, should this be taken as a sign of failure? I think the Corps' commitment to disabled ex-servicemen deserves to be celebrated, even if this commitment diminished. The organisation was progressive in the way that it promoted the interests of disabled men as employees in mainstream environments. And if one looks more broadly at ex-servicemen charities, even when they succeeded in providing long-term employment, their experiences of work could be unsatisfactory for these men. Such schemes kept these men apart from the able-bodied workforce. In philanthropic factories, often suffered the stigma of charity. This was not the case of the disabled commissionaires, whose identity was a positive one. By 1939, the Corps numbered just over 5,000 men, the majority of whom were able-bodied. But of course, even if the Corps had grown to 5,000, the number of men that it employed represented a fraction of the number of ex-servicemen who were looking for work rather in the interwar period. And I think this was entirely consistent with the way in which Walter envisaged the commissionaires and the exceptionalism that he claimed on their behalf. The commissionaire was never intended to be an everyman, which the representations I've shared with you today hopefully demonstrate. His attitudes around morality, sobriety, and self-reliance were very Victorian. Yet the Corps' approach to providing employment for disabled men in a mainstream environment was far-sighted, and the identity he created around disabled servicemen as worthy employees was extremely far-sighted, and in many respects prefigured some of the progressive employment schemes from the likes of St Dunstan's and the British Legion, which I mentioned earlier. So in that respect, it was very far-sighted, which is where I'd like to finish up. So, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sure people will have